we already know, like NEMA. You have the National Council for Refugees as well. But the IOM would appear to be the leading body here because of the funding it has. So you also have NAPTIP involved. What NAPTIP is doing now is basically concentrating now on preventing people from embarking on that trip, providing education, enlightenment campaigns and all of that to discourage people from embarking, discourage irregular migration basically. So that's what NAPTIP has been doing. It's also been going after traffickers as well. It's been able to secure quite a number of convictions. Some traffickers are standing trial. And but besides that too, NAPTIP says it is also providing assistance for some of these returnees as well. I'm talking about financial assistance now to enable them to reintegrate into society and then set up their own small enterprise and start life all over again. So, but IOM is the leading international agency in this. It's got some very good funding from the EU, and it's actually leading. While the other government agencies now are providing support, of course. Beatrice?
Adele, so Deji has mentioned the IOM and the European Union as some of the organizations that are assisting returnees in Nigeria particularly. So what are the international organizations doing, though, to help those migrants still stranded in Tripoli?
The most concerned is definitely the European Union. It is where the continent has been complaining of the huge influx of migrants from Libya and therefore has been the most involved in all the process of their living circumstances, the humanitarian condition for the migrants, and so on. This week, Cristina Mogherini said that the EU is working with Libya to create some sort of collection and departure centers for these migrants, at least to legalize some of them instead of encouraging or forcing them to go and take the dangerous Mediterranean route to Europe. The numbers of migrants going into Europe has more or less been quite steady. Italy alone has received some 3,500 migrants. Similar to that number have returned back to Libya through the sea. So the EU is concerned about investing in managing and regulating this process. Also, there is a big program that is ongoing to try to convince and take these migrants to go back to their original countries. The number of migrants, as I said earlier, who have returned to their homes are quite few. About 3,600 migrants have, 4,800 have chosen to go back, which is not a huge number from the tens of thousands in Libya itself. The UNHCR is also working with the IOM and the EU, trying to maintain that at least there is humanitarian support. There is a minimum requirement for a decent livelihood for these migrants, at least while they are stranded in Libya until they plan their future.
Adel Mahroui joining us there from Cairo. Deji Badmus joining us from Lagos. To you both, thank you. And we are staying on the topic of migration for the moment. In France, hundreds of undocumented migrants have stormed the Pantheon monument in central Paris on Friday. They are demanding the right to remain in France. Activists were chanting black vests, a reference to the recent anti-government yellow vest protests. Police on the scene reported that there were around 200 to 300 protesters, mostly from West Africa.
This is a place with lots of tourists and many other things, so we wanted to come here to show how angry we are because of the hardships we are going through. Before coming to France, we were told it was a country of human rights, but also liberty, equality and fraternity. But in fact, we didn't find this here in France. There's lots of racism. That's how it is.
Also, UGTN's Oliver Whitfield-Miocic is joining us from Paris for an update on this. Oliver, undocumented migrants stormed the Pantheon monument in Paris today. What do you know?
So Friday afternoon local time here in Paris, hundreds of undocumented migrants, mostly from Western Africa, stormed the Pantheon. It led to the police having to close the building down, evacuate some tourists who were inside. This is a big monument inside central Paris where some of the greatest writers and non-military people who have been buried have got their resting places there. Victor Hugo is laid to rest there. So This all came about because of the anger that the undocumented migrants say that they have got very bad living conditions here in France. They claim that there's 200,000 properties that are available for them to live in inside the Paris area, but they have got to sleep on the streets with very limited access to water and to food. The police came, they took them away in groups of 20 or so outside of the building. A few people were arrested, but the Black Vest protest movement, as it was known, saying that they would not leave until everybody was given settled status or that they were given some paperwork to say that they were allowed to live in France. That's a key demand that they've got. And of course, this isn't the first Black Vest protest movement that we've seen. Only 2 months ago, they stormed part of Charles de Gaulle Airport, the main airport here in Paris, demanding an end for Air France to stop deportation flights, because if undocumented migrants are caught by the police here and they are found to be needing to be removed from the country, it's usually Air France, as well as a couple of other airlines, which arranges those deportation flights. So this isn't the first movement that we've seen from the Black Vest movement, and it looks like it certainly won't be the last.
So, Oliver, they have made some demands, though. What happens now, or is this just going to be, protest after protest? What happens from here?
So the main problem with undocumented migrants comes from the fact that the EU-wide position on illegal immigration and on people who are coming to Europe from not only Northern Africa but also through the Balkan route through Turkey is there's a system in place known as the Dublin Agreement. Now, this agreement means that when a undocumented migrant comes into the first country that they step into, they're meant to be processed by that nation's authorities. And once they've got that processed paperwork, they're meant to stay in that country. The problem being is that the migrants are then meant to be sent to different countries to make it a fair system so that there's a burden across all of Europe and that all of the European nations take part, because countries in the Nordics such as Sweden and Denmark don't really get undocumented migrants because they're not on the main migration routes coming into Europe. Well, that system has all but fallen apart. EU leaders all agree that it needs to be revamped. And so there is this need for a change in the system, something that these undocumented migrants are calling for, because as it stands in France, anybody that does get to France who is an undocumented migrant has to basically sit it out here for a year with no work, begging on the streets, taking up illegal work if they have to, very little access to sanitary provision. They've got barely any sort of water or food. It gets very cold here in the winter. It's very warm here now in the summer. So the living conditions are absolutely dire. And so there is this need, as has been seen by both politicians and by the undocumented migrants themselves, who say that the system simply has to change. But speaking against, and this is one of the big reasons, one of the big voices against, Marine Le Pen, the far-right leader who runs the National Rally here in France, saying that the only journey for any illegal immigrant in France is to be deported out of the country. So very polarised views about what should happen to undocumented migrants here. There is some people in France who believe that they should be given some settled status, that they should be taken care of, but then there is other people on the far right who say this is a burden that France cannot carry anymore.
Very polarized views indeed. Oliver Woodfield-Miochi joining us there from Paris. Thank you. Now, the Islamic movement of Nigeria, a Shia religious group, are protesting in Lagos for the release of their leader. Ibrahim El-Zakazaki has been in government custody since 2015. There are a number of court orders granting El-Zakazaki bail. The government has stated he is in protective custody with his family. The protests follow a violent confrontation between members of the sect and policemen in the Nigerian capital, Abuja.
If you have 21 million followers and your followers gather 1,000 naira each, that is 21 billion solid naira. If we were people that want war, we could buy 21 billion naira worth of weapons. But we are peaceful people. Our leader has taught us to be people of peace, and we love Nigeria, and we do not want anything bad to happen to our country.
El-Zakazaki has been arrested for the past 4 years now without any offense, and the court of law has granted him bail. And the government and the president who swear to adhere to the Constitution of Nigeria has refused to obey the court. 1,000 people were killed in Zaria. They were not having guns. They were killed right inside their house. And the government of the day set up a panel. And that panel has come out and indicted the government. And the paper has been given to the government. The federal government has put that paper under the carpet. What we are asking is that the president should not be a dictator. He should obey the rule of law in order not to cause anarchy.
Meanwhile, in Somalia's port city of Kismayo, a car bomb went off in a hotel. The bomb went off as local elders and lawmakers were meeting. Gunfire followed the bomb's detonation. Al-Shabaab has claimed responsibility for the attack. Fighting between militants and security forces is still ongoing, and casualties have yet to be published. And staying in Somalia, the country has welcomed back more than 100,000 former refugees from Yemen and Kenya. But now the influx of Somali returnees from Kenya has worsened the humanitarian crisis in a country that is already dealing with a high number of internally displaced persons. From Mogadishu, CGTN's Abdulaziz Bilo has the story.
These returnees are the latest to arrive in Somalia. For close to 3 decades, the Dadaab refugee camp in northern Kenya was their home, as conflict ravaged most parts of their country. In 2013, Somalia, Kenya and the UN refugee body signed a tripartite agreement that supports the voluntary return of refugees back to Somalia, a process that has seen a huge number of returnees resettled in various parts of the country.
Since 2015, we have repatriated 84,000 people, mainly young people, school-aged children. Many people are coming back their own way without support of repatriation assistance. In Dadaab alone, there were 500,000 and now it's 200,000. That means all others came to Somalia because we have the figure for repatriated people, which is 84,000.
However, the return of the refugees, mainly from Kenya, has increased the burden on the government's ability to cater for the needs of vulnerable communities affected by years of conflict and climatic shocks. Since 2010, more than 2 million mostly affected farmers and the pastoral community.
The biggest challenge is housing, healthcare, and education for returnees, especially children. Unemployment is also a big threat. Families cannot sustain their livelihood due to competition. We have more than 2 million people living as IDPs. Somalia needs much support to handle the growing influx of returned from Kenya and Yemen.
More than 200,000 Somalis are believed to be residing in the Dadaab complex, but Kenyan authorities insist on closing the facility while blaming it for rising insecurity in parts of that country. Rights groups and the government of Somalia, however, warn Kenya against any forced repatriation.
We have an agreement with Kenya that no refugee will be forced to return. The exercise has to be voluntary, as agreed in the tripartite agreement between Kenya, Somalia, and the UNHCR. Kenya cannot force people out of Dadaab. It has signed the Geneva Convention and must protect refugees.
Close to 40,000 refugees have also returned from Yemen as conflict rages on in the Arab nation. Somalia says it's ready and willing to accept its nationals returning back home, but wants international support to ensure that these former refugees restart a new dignified life in a safe place which they can call home. Abdulaziz Bilo, CGTN, Mogadishu, Somalia.
In South Africa, armed forces have been called in to assist the police fight against rampant levels of crime in some of Cape Town's most dangerous neighborhoods. The country's President Cyril Ramaphosa authorized the deployment of the army after the police failed to bring down the high levels of violent crimes. The move has been widely welcomed. Here's CGTN's Travis Andrews.
The Cape Flats is on lockdown with a heavy police presence in some of the city's most crime-ridden neighborhoods. They're here as part of a crime-fighting operation that will include the army. The South African National Defence Force are set to join the police in their anti-crime blitz, targeting criminals wanted for murders, robberies and drug offences. They will also be searching for weapons, and Philippi East is one area where the police have already begun their search and seizures. But some believe drugs is also a major problem.
I think they must first also have to look for these drug houses that are selling the drugs. and those drugs are promoting the young guys and people to steal when they are drunk. So I think that's better.
The police have struggled to contain the amount of drugs ending up in communities, even though they've committed enormous amounts of resources to their efforts. Just a few days ago, 11 people were killed in this neighborhood in just a 24-hour period, sparking massive outrage amongst many Cape Townians. Now, the South African National Defence Force has in the past assisted the police with bringing peace and stability to South African townships, including quelling issues around xenophobic violence. This operation, however, is a different scenario. That's because the armed forces will focus on issues such as gangsterism and drug smuggling. Catching wanted criminals is also high on the agenda, and many community members are happy they are coming.
We feel very excited at the same time and safer than the last time, because now we'll be more protected than we used to be, and surely they can do something about this because it's already getting out of hand.
I feel like we'll be protected, especially in those high crime areas. And then you find that it's difficult even for you to go to work. You find people are doing anything, whatever they like.
For now, though, the joint operation is expected to take around 3 months to conduct and could continue if the president feels that the saturation of forces in these communities still haven't sent a clear message to criminals that their time is up. Travis Andrews, CGTN, Cape Town.
You're watching Africa Live, still ahead on the program. Africa urged to strengthen cooperation and regional partnerships to prevent and counter terrorism. And 200 African candidates picked for Obama's Leaders Program.
Drowning at our beaches is very high. So this program, at the long-term objective, is to have a marine search and rescue squad that will be deployed to respond to emergencies as and when they happen.
You've got a group of people here who are dedicated and are looking to do something good to improve their country, to make their beaches a little bit more safe and save some lives. And it takes that kind of dedication because this is a hard job.
As per last training we had, 120 people were trained. At the moment, we're looking at maybe 200 people trained. I think that is a good number to start with.
A landmark conference on the prevention of violent extremism has agreed to strengthen cooperation and regional partnerships to prevent and counter terrorism. President Uhuru Kenyatta and the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres inaugurated the two-day conference at the UN complex in Nairobi. CGTN's Robert Nagila has more.
Attended by close to 1,500 delegates from UN member states and regional organizations, the Counter-Terrorism Conference hosted by Kenya and the UN Office for Counter-Terrorism was the largest ever meeting of African states on terrorism.
I deeply believe that African peace enforcing and counter-terrorism operations must have strong and clear mandates by the UN Security Council, backed by sufficient, predictable and sustainable financial support, namely through assessed contributions.
Discussions and solutions should propose multifaceted approaches to combating terrorism, extremism and radicalization that confronts the vice on the battlefield, in places of worship, in marketplaces, in our schools, as well as our homes.
Among the key resolutions agreed upon are a collective commitment to build new and strengthen partnerships between African states and between African states and the rest of the international community. The need to share intelligence, good practices and lessons learnt between African countries. To build institutional capacities and capabilities. To establish African regional and sub-regional counter-terrorism cooperation based on the African Union Peace and Security Architecture. To engage the youth and promote gender-sensitive approaches to counter-terrorism, and finally, engaging the civil society. The conference is a follow-up to the first ever United Nations high-level conference of heads of counter-terrorism agencies of member states in June 2018. Robert Nagila, CGTN, Nairobi.
A year has passed since Ethiopia and Eritrea agreed to a peace deal, breaking a stalemate that had existed for 2 decades between the two states. While relations have improved, Ethiopia and Eritrea have yet to implement their new political and economic relationship. CGTN's Coletta Wanjohi reports from Addis Ababa.
Eritreans living in Ethiopia no longer feel the need to hide their nationality. Air transport between the two states is open, but all 4 border crossings between the two countries are closed from the Eritrea side, with no explanation over why. Analysts say a year has passed since the peace agreement, and now both countries must work on implementing special status protocols.
They should work properly on the rules and regulations, which can make the friendly relationship a very good one. Like, for instance, there is a good relationship between Djibouti and Ethiopia. There is a special one. There is special treatment for also between Kenya and Ethiopia, as they are neighbors. So probably they need to negotiate that kind of proper and special treatment of each other, because both will benefit from these treaties. So this one, I think, will take time for them to come with a good plan.
Some citizens, however, remain skeptical about the truce. Kiflum fled Eritrea 4 years ago. He is now a refugee in Ethiopia. He volunteers at the Jesuit Refugee Service, where he assists fellow refugees with online courses. Quite a contrast from his expertise in geographic information systems back home.
No, because I fled from my country because of the political situation, but I don't think to go back to my country.
Like many other Eritrean refugees, he is banking on a new law passed by Ethiopia to allow refugees to work here, which would allow him to start afresh. Analysts say both countries must find peace within their territories to be able to maintain a practical friendship. Ethiopia must work to iron out the divisions within the ruling coalition and fight against ethnic discrimination, while Eritrea must reform some of its policies.
They should also resolve the internal conflicts they have within. When you go to Eritrea side, Isaias has to somehow be flexible and open, do some kind of reform like we have seen in Ethiopia, especially forgiving the opposition, those who left the country because they refused to be part of the national service, the military. Those kind of reform is also expected on that side.
Both countries are yet to make progress in establishing special joint economic zones, as well as a high-level committee to oversee the implementation of the agreement. As Ethiopia seeks economic progress, the country is keen to ensure that the truce with Eritrea holds. A major reason for this is that Eritrea's ports are more cost-effective as compared to Djibouti's, where currently Ethiopia's majority of goods enter and leave. And it is hoped that lasting peace will ensure economic prospects for both states. Coletta Njoyi, CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Well, let's now go to Penina Karibe for a look at the day's business news. Penina. Thank you, Beatrice. Coming up on Africa Live Business. The International Energy Agency raises concerns of an impending oversupply of oil this year. And
where opportunity meets innovation, where profitable new markets collide with global trends. From the sound of an African bell on a stock market's floor to the shout of the trader in a bustling free market. It's colorful, vibrant, and exotic. CGTN stands at the gateway to Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. From Morocco to South Africa, we talk to the deal makers and actors who fuel its engines of growth. Only on CGTN.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
The The International Energy Agency says surging U.S. oil output will outpace sluggish global demand and lead to a large stocks build around the world in the next 9 months. The forecasts appear to predict the need for producer club OPEC and its allies to reduce production to balance the market despite extending their existing pact. The IEA says demand for OPEC crude oil in early 2020 could fall to only 28 million barrels per day, with non-OPEC expansion in 2020 rising by 2.1 million barrels per day. A full 2 million barrels per day is expected to come from the United States. At current OPEC output levels of 30 million barrels per day, the IEA predicts that global oil stocks could rise by 136 million barrels by the end of the first quarter of 2020. The International Monetary Fund has approved a bailout worth nearly $449 million for the Republic of Congo. Congo's economy suffered from a sharp drop in crude prices in 2014, and debt levels had shot up to 118% of GDP by 2017. The negotiations have dragged on for 2 years, with the fund demanding that Congo ensure the long-term sustainability of its debt as a precondition for a 3-year extended credit facility program. The country's Chinese debt stood at nearly $2.56 billion at the end of March. South African retailer Steinhoff has reported a little over $400 million in half-year losses from continuing operations as remnants of a massive accounting scandal drag on. Steinhoff first flagged holes in its accounts in December 2017, an accounting fraud that has since been put at over $7 billion. It's the third time this year the retailer has published its results following the publication of its delayed 2017 and 2018 annual reports in May and June respectively. South Africa's biggest corporate scandal has all but wiped out shareholders' equity and led to several resignations, including former Chief Executive Marcus Joost. Still in the country, there's been a sharp increase in South Africans moving their investments offshore. The weak economy and uncertain political climate is pushing a number of South Africans to look for safer havens overseas, not only for their money, but for their families too. Sumitra Naidu takes a look at some of the issues behind this trend.
It's been a rough few years in South Africa. The economy is weak and unemployment is at an all-time high.
So over the last 3 years, we've failed to break 2% economic growth in the country. And that's really, sad, given the fact that there was so much hope in terms of SA. This is one of the most active, emerging markets in Africa.
John T. Leon is a partner at Financial Immigration, a tax company that assists South Africans that want to seize their tax residency and move offshore. Financial Immigration says it's experiencing a massive uptick in inquiries, people either wanting to move their investments abroad or seize their tax residency in South Africa, and even wanting to physically emigrate altogether.
Because they're worried and want to safeguard their assets or their investments. So the company's been around for about 11 years now. And if we just look back at the past years, from last year to this year, there's a 200% increase in inquiries.
President Cyril Ramaphosa is trying his utmost to pull investors in, but concerns around governance breaches at state institutions and issues around state capture persist and seem to have sapped investor confidence.
The very bad exchange rate and the weak currency of South Africa and the possibility that investments in South Africa will only decrease and not get better. And I think the biggest one, the one that always comes up in consultations with clients, is the political instability of this country. And the major one, especially for instance the past year, has been the talks around land expropriation without compensation.
There has been few issues really, apart from the land issue in terms of the nationalization of the central bank, the Reserve Bank of South Africa. And there are different views. Possibly that also unsettles investors. But I think broadly, people want hard currencies. Remember, the dollar or euro is almost like a security on its own. It's like you buying an asset because you want to hedge yourself against the rand depreciating.
It's been touch and go in South Africa for a while now. Drastic changes to policy may be the only solution to arresting the economic decline and the outflow of people and their money. Sumitra Naidu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
According to a World Bank report on Ghana's economy, the country is proving to be the fastest growing mobile money market in Africa. The report focused on financial sector development and financial inclusion. As a result, the West African nation is witnessing an expansion in its financial services, startups and small businesses. One such startup is carpooling company Rubberides. It operates on an app and leverages mobile money for payments. CGTN's Nabil Ahmed Rufai reports from Accra.
CC John is ordering a carpooling service. Like in many areas of the world, he's paying for it instantly on his phone using a mobile money service platform. He then waits for the car to arrive.
It's much convenient than the usual services we are all accustomed to. The fact that it's cashless as well makes it come without any controversy, the problem of looking for change and whatnot.
This carpooling service by startup company Rubberides can only be accessed through a mobile phone app. While that's common in cities like New York or Johannesburg and Nairobi, the concept is relatively new to Ghana. It's predicted that about 40 million mobile phones will be in use in Ghana by 2020. Growth like this means carpooling companies like Rubberides will be using mobile money services for payments more and more. Last year, Ghana introduced the operating system to allow mobile money transfers between all mobile networks and banks. The platform has so far recorded over 4.4 million transactions. However, startup company Rubberides says more needs to be done to improve mobile money services between different mobile networks.
A lot of the networks are kind of working in their own silos or their own systems in terms of mobile money. If you have to transfer from one to another, it's not as seamless as if you are transferring through the same network. So that might be an issue sometimes for most of the businesses that are trying to use that, or platforms like us that is using that.
The Bank of Ghana says it's taking steps to streamline the mobile money service sector. It plans to introduce a new capital requirement for all institutions engaged in mobile money operation amid growing concerns.
By putting in place regulation, you try to ensure that operators, for example, put in place a robust system so that fraud is not perpetrated. The next thing we have done also to ensure that we have more players coming into the system so that it will engender competition.
Users of mobile money services like CC believe once the regulation is passed, it will get easier to use the platform, which in turn will boost the economy. Nabil Ahmed Rufai, CGTN, Accra, Ghana.
Cote d'Ivoire's capital recently hosted the International Project Investment Forum. The event aims to attract new financing mechanisms for infrastructure in Africa. Alexandria Majala has the details.
This event has brought together decision makers and stakeholders from both the public and private sectors. At the summit, investors called for the implementation of innovative methods of resource mobilization to finance infrastructure in emerging economies across Africa.
Today we have more and more involvement of investment funds and public-private partnerships. We also have the involvement of commercial banks, which, depending on the size or their networks, have the capacity to absorb infrastructure financing that involves very large amounts.
Entrepreneurs from West Africa seeking investment partners got the chance to interact with potential financiers.
We discovered several opportunities and especially some funding mechanisms that we did not know. This forum also gave us opportunity to be in direct contact with investors. I can assure you that Gabon will not hesitate to contact these investors and financiers and training structures in order to reach our financial objectives.
Experts present at the forum said that African countries show a willingness to mobilize resources for infrastructure. However, many of these countries still face tremendous difficulties in obtaining financing or attracting investors.
The IMF is very demanding in terms of debt capacity of developing countries. It imposes conditions in terms of debt load, but also in terms of concessional interest rate, which is often very restrictive for some lenders. In addition to the conditions of the IMF, the problem of the quality of the human resources of the teams who are in charge of the project implementation is also an obstacle to financing of infrastructures in Africa.
Our goal is to make countries learn from each other. For example, Gabonese actors must learn from those in Cote d'Ivoire, and those in Togo must learn from those in Burkina and vice versa. In addition, we wanted to bring project leaders closer to investors in order to facilitate agreements. I can say that we have achieved our goal.
During the two-day meet, participants shared experiences in project design, development, financing, and implementation of infrastructure projects. The Forum on Project Investment was also an opportunity to give practical training on infrastructure projects in Africa. Alexandria Majala for CGTN.
We shall leave it there for now, but later on Global Business, we'll be looking at Kenya's decision not to renew licenses for 27 betting companies. We'll have the details of that story and plenty more at the top of the hour. I shall see you then. For now, Beatrice, back to you. Indeed, Penina, thank you very much. And we still have more news, views and analysis for you here on the program. To stay with us.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Kanater, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
The Obama Foundation's Leaders Africa program has kicked off in Johannesburg for a second year running. The initiative was launched last year during the centenary birthday celebrations of one of South Africa's greatest leaders, Nelson Mandela. This year's intake of 200 outstanding individuals are from 45 different countries on the continent. CGTN's Shia has more.
The Obama Foundation's African Leadership Class of 2019 is now in session in Johannesburg. 200 promising young leaders from all over the continent are handpicked every year to be part of a 12-month program.
You all were chosen for this program because you're rooted in your communities. You understand your neighbors and you realize that unleashing their extraordinary potential requires thoughtful, inclusive, and ethical leadership. That's what this week and the next year is all about, unlocking the promise of Africa through people like you.
The initiative focuses on ethical leadership, strengthening critical thinking and developing problem-solving skills to tackle challenges faced by impoverished communities in Africa.
It's such an honor, but also I think there's a tremendous level of responsibility I think we all carry for this gift and opportunity of being here. So in my viewpoint for the next week, I'm looking to listen, learn, receive as much as I can.
So it's been a great platform for me to learn and also strengthen my resolve to continue to do the work. I believe change will come if we all keep lighting those lights in our ends, in our corners. Change will definitely come.
Obama leaders get lifetime access to global networks and resources. Some who were on last year's program have already started to reap the benefits.
I took the bold step and actually decided to transition out of my full-time job and as a software engineer and to focus fully on my work at Accurachicks. In 2019, we launched our campus. So we moved from just teaching 20 to 25 girls a year from just Nairobi and to training 50 girls from 14 different regions of the country.
I try to be as vocal as I can on specific issues. One big issue is the issue of corruption. I've spoken out a lot about it. I even voted down the creation of a corruption-fighting body because I genuinely believed, and demonstrably so, that it did not have the right powers to do an effective job.
Africa will remain the Obama Foundation's primary focus, but it's looking at expanding the program to other parts of the world, including Asia, South America and the Middle East. Judishara, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Well, let's now take a look at your sports news. Here's what's ahead. Algerian fans are over the moon as the Desert Foxes beat Cote d'Ivoire to proceed to the last four in the Africa Cup of Nations.
Africa, where champions are made, records are broken, legends are born. We're there for every goal, for every knockout, for every